We are studying Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Kena Upanishad, and we have now taken up chapter 8, to which he has not given a name, but which deals with the term eye of our eye and ear of our ear, which the Kena Upanishad uses. Sri Aurobindo begins by putting in context the discussion by stating that the Kena Upanishad spoke of speech of our speech as Brahman, then mind of our mind as Brahman, and now it turns to the eyes and ears, and for each there is a deeper seeing which is Brahman, deeper hearing which is Brahman, and the whole theme now is the senses. After this, in the later chapter, will be breath, life breath, breath of our breath. And so we are seeing here a clear development in the Kena Upanishad, where it is showing us step by step the four central aspects of the human experience, and for each of these it is showing something behind, something higher, which is the real thing and which is Brahman, of which this is a secondary, reflected or distorted working. In the earlier chapters we saw how the functioning of the mind is a reflected and distorted working of a higher power of cognition, and mind itself, as we saw there, is working in the very opposite way of this higher supermind, which is truly Brahman. And so in each of these, when the Kena Upanishad shows that there is a higher faculty, a higher power of cognition, even eventually a higher life, it's showing us a continuity from our human experience and its four primary characteristics to their higher functioning in Brahman. And by showing continuity, it is showing us a way by which we can rise from the human consciousness and the human life experience to a divine consciousness and a divine experience in continuity. And in Sri Aurobindo's commentary, as he reveals to us the relationship between this and that, Sri Aurobindo shows the full picture from below looking up, from above looking down, and the full continuity in between. He shows us the steps and the stages by which our consciousness can ascend into the divine consciousness, retaining therefore in the ascent the whole experience of the creative word, the speech manifesting creativity, of the power of cognition rising from mind to supermind, and now in this chapter, the senses, taking particularly the eyes and the ears, but generally the senses. Also, as we rise in consciousness, the senses rise and there is a different kind of perception. And finally, in a later chapter, it will be the life itself, the life breath, which sustains our life, that also ascending into a divine life, completing the process. So in this chapter, Sri Aurobindo has taken up the senses, and he now questions our conception of the senses. Our idea of the senses is an action of the organs through which embodied mind communicates with external matter. And these sense organs have developed separately in evolution, and all sensation therefore takes place in and through the sense organs. If you didn't have ears, if the ears hadn't developed, you would have no hearing. If you didn't have the eyeballs, retina, etc., you would not have sight. And having seen this perspective of science superficially, Sri Aurobindo questions it. And he says there is a deeper truth to it. He says this is not the last word about sense. This is only the outward appearance behind which we must penetrate. And then he begins to question what is it that happens in the sensory process, and leads us step by step to a recognition. We have discussed this in detail, so we don't repeat. He leads us step by step to a recognition that sense is in essence mental contact with an object and the mental reproduction of its image. In between, we saw there were 3 layers of translation taking place in the 3 sheaths. And in the material Anna Kosha, there is the physical contact in which an image is received and formed. Then in the Prana Kosha, the vital and nervous contact in which there is a nervous formation. And then the mental contact in the Manha Kosha, where there is a mental imaging. And that's where we say, now we have a sense experience. And therefore, he says, in essence, it is a mental contact with the object and the mental reproduction of its image. So there are two components, the contact and then the formation of the image. The reality of this is so vivid when we introspect. We actually do not know what the world is like. We only know how our mind perceives the information given to the mind. And this is how we have so many possibilities of playing with reality. We have today the whole experience of virtual reality, where images and sounds are fed to us, and the mind is very quickly convinced that it is seeing a completely different domain, a completely different reality, and begins to live in it. It takes a few seconds, sometimes at most half a minute, before we are convinced of the reality of what we see through the virtual reality device. Even when we watch a movie, it takes a few minutes perhaps before we are fully identified in the world of the cinema. We forget ourselves and our environment. It helps that the space is made dark, and that's why we take care to isolate distracting sounds and sights, so that the mind is allowed an exclusive concentration. A similar thing takes place when we read a book, and especially a more elaborate novel which creates its own domain of reality. After a while, when we snap out of it, we lose perspective, which is more real, the world we were immersed in for a whole hour or for the last few days, or this reality which is not so familiar anymore. The mind, in fact, perceiving through its senses is our primary contact, is our sense experience. This is the reason why also under hypnosis one can play with the sensory appearance of reality, and we have touched upon this in the earlier discussion. Even changing colors, changing forms, making things vanish. All of this is possible because the real life is being lived in the mind. This idea has been played with in many science fiction stories, and in particular the recent movie which was called Matrix, where a person is plugged into a computer and the computer generates all the 5 senses, and we live in that world. We actually think that we are there. Even our body sensations are really mind's contact with the inputs coming in, and therefore under hypnosis or under such a virtual reality that plugs directly into the brain, one could even have sensations of the body which are entirely constructed artificially. So the central idea here that he brings us to is this, that sense then may be described as in its essence mental contact with an object and the mental reproduction of its image. We have therefore only the mental image of it, which is the reality that we know. We never know the thing in itself. This is the reason why we so easily deceive ourselves when we are convinced of the reality of somebody else's intentions, somebody else's thoughts, or even their actions and motivations. We have inferred certain things, guessed them, often projected our own expectations onto them, and created a whole world that we are convinced is real. And when suddenly the evidence hits us that this is all our own fantasy, it is a painful shock. It is the mental reproduction of an image which is the only reality that we know. And therefore, in the Buddhist experience, they speak of the whole world as being essentially a product of the mind. And therefore, all suffering in life as a product of the mind. And the solution, because it's the shortest and simplest solution to get free of suffering, is kill the mind. Get free of the mind. And then you're free of suffering. It is a solution. It may not be the best solution for all. From the Vedantic perspective, it is a shortcut that bypasses the whole purpose of this manifestation. But the logic is valid, and even the result, the conclusion is valid. And here we recognize how important it is for us to purify the mind, to be able to see truly. Subsequently then, because the mind depends on the two other sheaths, to purify the life energies and our emotions and expectations in order to be able to receive more truly what comes and not get distorted in translation, and finally even train the physical senses to be able to see truly. It's only when all three are purified and completely aligned that our world experience becomes more reliable. Even then, we are always bound to the limitation of the mind's perception. And at some point, we need to be able to see as truly as the divine or the creative consciousness sees. And it is towards this that now Sri Aurobindo takes us. In preparation, in transition to this, where he will show us how supermind sees, he sets us a transitional passage where he shows what it would be like if our primary reality was not material but was mental. And this was the paragraph we last saw. He says, imagine that there is a mental world in which mind is the base and not matter. Their sense would be the mind seeing an image in mind and throwing it into form in more and more gross substance. Right now there's an image in matter which goes through grossest substance to subtler substance, and then mind gets it. But if mind was the base, then mind would see directly mind meeting mind and then would push it into grosser substance to give it form. And there, the substance, the physical formations would respond rapidly to mind and obey its modifying suggestions, and so mind would be masterful, creative, originative, and not, as at present, obedient and merely reproductive to matter. Because right now the mind is embedded in the body, it is dependent on the body's limitations, but there it is free and creative. It would not have to struggle with material resistance. This transitional idea prepares us for a truth, a great truth which will become more and more manifest as humanity evolves, and that is the truth that our creative power is above, in the supermind. And when mind is infused with the supramental consciousness, it can play its masterful, creative and originative role. And when that supramental consciousness is established all the way in the physical body, and the physical substance becomes responsive to it in a physical transformation, then that supramental creative faculty will be able to mold the physical substance as freely as right now mind molds mental substance. And it is in this direction that our evolution is leading us. Although the physical transformation may be some distance away, the awakening of the physical consciousness already makes possible a greater plasticity in the physical body, and the mind's will on it can begin to shape and modify it. And this is within our reach as we are today. But the idea here is important. And now Sri Aurobindo moves to the higher perception of things. What really happens in the highest sense perception? How exactly does mind actually have this grasping through senses and the seeing of truth of things? And how does supermind do it, and the relationship between the two? This is over the next 3 paragraphs, of which we will perhaps take up only the first 2. He begins like this. Mind, in fact, or active consciousness generally, has 4 necessary functions which are indispensable to it, wherever and however it may act, and of which the Upanishads speak in 4 terms: Vijnana, Prajnana, Samjnana, and Ajnana. And then he explains all 4. So the first idea here is this: not just in mind, but he says any active consciousness has these 4 necessary functions. Recognize then that our definition of the senses has been broadened. Not merely what happens through biological sense organs, but a basic contact of consciousness with an object. Considering that all objects are essentially consciousness also, the highest sense is consciousness meeting consciousness. This is how Sri Aurobindo describes it in the Synthesis of Yoga. All sense experience essentially boils down to consciousness meeting other consciousness, which is itself essentially on a deeper level. But let's say sense meeting object. Consciousness meeting object. But which consciousness? On all levels. Therefore, there is a physical consciousness meeting object, vital consciousness, mental consciousness, supramental consciousness meeting object. Even we can speak of Satchidananda, and in the domain of Satchidananda there would be sense experience, not the way we have it, perhaps differently, but still it would be there. So sense is something fundamental to consciousness on all levels. So mind, in fact, or active consciousness generally, and Sri Aurobindo is so precise in his vocabulary, active consciousness, not passive. We might say, when I go into trance, I lose all sense of the world. But if you observe carefully, in that trance state, you have perception of things of that inner state. In that inward turn, you have an inward sight, an inward contact, an inward experience of life. It may be essential, it may be some formless, spaceless, timeless reality, but still there is a perception of it. Or we may have even transcended that, and then we say, then I have nothing. Yes, that is because your consciousness has become passive. When the consciousness becomes completely passive, immersed in a static, unmoving, unchanging consciousness of the silent Brahman, then we may say perhaps there is no real sense experience, and yet there is awareness, and awareness of that static condition. Though we may not like to use the word sense, it is still consciousness knowing consciousness, and therefore essentially sense. But no distinction of sense anymore. So he uses this word, any active consciousness generally has 4 necessary functions which are indispensable to it, wherever and however it may act. If active consciousness has to act, and action means there is something against which there is a relationship, then there have to be these 4 necessary functions. Again, we are entering into a domain where you will find it is a description of not only consciousness perceiving, but it is a direct, rational, scientific, even process-oriented description which has direct implications in artificial intelligence. So 4 terms: Vijnana, Prajnana, Samjnana, Ajnana. all of which he now defines. Vijnana is the original comprehensive consciousness. Naturally, the supramental, original, because it is in there that the whole comprehension, comprehending is holding, containing the whole thing. Comprehensive consciousness, which holds an image of things at once in their essence, its totality, and its parts and properties. So the character of this is, there's an image of things, yes, but all four components of things, of the image, are simultaneously present. There is the essence of the image, there is the totality of the image, there are the parts of the image, and then the properties. Now, if you look at any experience, let's say, flower. There are properties of the flower. This one smells sweet, that one smells tangy, the third one smells like rotten substance. All of these are variations of its perfume. It has other properties of colors, of texture, shapes, and so on. Separate from the properties and on a higher level of organization, more generic, are parts. So it has petals, it has the central stem, it has the things where it puts out the, what do you call, pistil? The insides where the perfume is set. And you may have different parts in this way. Each of those parts are differently shaped, perhaps, even within the species. So if you take a rose, you say these are petals, and yet you look at all the petals, they're differently shaped. From one rose to another, they're differently shaped, and yet you call them all petals. So it is a kind of a generic idea. From rose to, let's say, another flower, not only the petals have different colors, different textures, there's a different perfume, and still you call them petals. The stem is differently shaped, still you call it stem. So the properties being totally different, we have a generic category that we call petal or stem. So the parts of the experience of flower are more generic, in which properties may vary enormously, and yet the concept of the parts is common. Now we go a step above. We speak of the totality. It is all these parts with petals, with stem, and with the inside together which makes for flower. And yet we have a generic term, flower, to describe rose, to describe plasticity, to describe psychological perfection, whatever the different kinds of flowers. We have one term to say flower. Within that same term flower, each of the flowers of the same species are different, and yet we call that rose. So there is a totality of something we call rose, which is distinct from the totality of something which I would call psychological perfection. So there is a totality of flower in which there are parts, of which there are properties, and there could be innumerable variations of properties for common part concepts, innumerable variations within those parts to make for the totality of what we call the rose, the flower. And then there is something even more essential. That is the essence of the idea. There is an essence of rose. All these variations of types of rose, there's a rose which is red, there's a rose which is yellow, there's a rose which is small, another which is large, there's a rose which has bloomed and a rose which is still in bud, and yet we call them all rose. Can you define for me what is rose? And at that point you find you have no words. You have an idea of rose, and the idea itself has no form. But it is associated to with a whole variation of forms of that thing which we call rose. How do you relate this essential rose idea to form of rose? Can you turn that idea into words, or can you take a few physical examples and define the idea? You don't have words anymore. There's something which is essential, which is formless, which is pure idea of rose. And yet we all know it. We all have it. Even a little child at the age of 1 or 2 can barely speak, will recognize this is rose. So where does this happen? Where does this idea come? And how important this is. If we didn't have this, then each time we saw a different shaped rose, we would ask, what is this? And someone would say, it's a rose. But you'll say, no, that's not true. That one is rose. This is not rose. This is smaller. This has a different shape. How can you call it the same thing? So you can imagine a mind which is not developed in those higher faculties would struggle to hold a central, essential idea across these variations. This is the problem we have with computers in artificial intelligence. A computer can be shown, here is an example of rose, and it will match it against exact same pictures. But the moment you change the shape and create variations, it cannot handle it anymore. At least that was the earlier situation. Today we have developed softwares which allows for this kind of recognition, and the computer can be taught a large number of examples of the same rose, and it is able to generalize conceptually at some level this idea of rose. And then you can show any number of variations and it will recognize it. But it has to be taught. What happens there, it's interesting to see how it is actually done. This is done through what are called neural networks, an imitation of the way the brain works, large numbers of neurons interconnected. And each time an image is shown, the neurons respond and pass on their response to the next level, which responds and passes on to the next level, and you can have several layers. And then when an image is shown, you have to teach the network this is what it corresponds to. So you have idea of rose, and you're teaching the network to associate idea of rose with this. And each time it gets it wrong, there is a reverse rippling, changing the connection strengths to bring it closer to a response which would point to idea of rose. Similarly, you have idea of dog. And when an image of dog is shown, if there's a wrong response, there's a correction that ripples through, adjusting things until it matches. And then you have idea of tree or whatever it is. And so you have set for the computer certain central ideas, and then there's a whole training process going through thousands, perhaps even millions of images, training the network to associate idea with the image. And after a while, it works very well. This is called deep learning in today's vocabulary, and very computationally intensive. But with this today, a computer is able to recognize faces, recognize objects, name them precisely. But the important thing is the computer itself never developed the idea. We had the idea of rose, we taught it to associate with this. We can still train computers showing categories of similar images and get the computer to organize itself and develop its own ideas. And then we discover on the highest levels of the network, it creates certain essential concepts. But they are not in the way we know them. They are only clusterings of classifications. Having classified all the images of rose, here is one category, it still does not know roseness of rose, flowerness of flower. And so this is where we seem to be able to stop. This is how, as far as we are able to go right now. There needs to be a consciousness which gives value and meaning to the experience of classification. And it is this which we have in us at the level of the essence and even the totality of rose. Essence can go even deeper. You have essential idea of rose, essential idea of lotus, and common to all of these is essential idea of flower. Can you define flower? And you'll find again you're lost for words. Because it's going across such a wide variation, classifications of so many types of flowers, and yet there's there's a flower, nests of flower, which to us is very real in experience. And somehow we never have to think about it or even rationally develop this, it takes place automatically. There's a very important idea that Sri Aurobindo will elaborate here. There are processes taking place within us which are automatic, and there are processes taking place in us which involve the rationality. Those are the parts where rationality has to struggle, which are still not aligned to the higher working of supermind. And so he will show us how we can actually connect with the supermind and ascend into a supramental consciousness through the mind's working. So Vijnana is the original comprehensive consciousness which holds an image of things at once in its essence, its totality, and its parts, and its properties. All four at once together. Now that's another problem. When you're focused on properties, are you conscious of the parts? When you're focused on the parts, are you conscious of the totality or the essence? But this holds all four at the same time in a single image. We can have an image of the properties, a red rose, pink lotus. We can have an image of the parts, lotus petal, rose petal. We can have an image of totality, full lotus, full rose. But the moment we move to essence of lotus, you can't have an image anymore. Essence of rose, you can't have an image anymore. Essence of flower, no way you can have an image. Or, if you have an image, it would be an image which holds all these possible variations. All variations of lotus, all variations of rose, variations in color, size, shape, states, conditions of development. A faded rose is still a rose. A dried rose is still a rose. A crushed rose is still a rose, although crushed. All variations together held, but then you can't have a very clear picture, it becomes blurred. So you do not have an image of essence. You can have images of all the other three levels. But in Vijnana, you have an image of things at once in its essence and totality and parts and properties. So obviously, Vijnanam is not in its functioning something which the mind is able to access, our rational mind. It is something which is at the edge. As you approach this idea, essential idea of rose, it blurs and mind becomes numbed, blanked. But if somehow I feel as if I could cross across this border, I could hold something. And that would be the entry point to supermind's perception. So you see, it's not such a big difference when you look at it in these terms. The transition from the intellectual, divisive, analytic mind which handles pieces to the supramental consciousness which handles totalities, identities, continuities, infinities. The transition does not feel so radical when you try to enter experientially like this. But mind falls back, it lapses. The moment you try to conceive of essence of rose, mind by habit tends to try to create a picture and loses it. But if you could teach mind to not get into activity of forming picture, but to hold awareness only, and a kind of an essential awareness without forming image, and move gently into that direction, you'll find mind's image formation becomes numbed, but an awareness continues. And an awareness which can be held only when the mind is taught to be silent. And in the silence of the mind, you're able to hold pure concept of rose, pure concept of flowerness and just hold it still. And we are still in domain of mind, but that's the point through which we are now able to receive an influence from the supermind. An influence which is a reduced, narrowed, made finite, we call it intuition. And so when we are silent, when we hold this pure idea, something touches from above gently, and suddenly you see, you know, you're aware in identity. Ah, I have an idea. So you take a problem, go through all its properties, analysis of its parts, look at it in its totality finally, and then try to go into its essence. Become very quiet. Let your mind rise, drift upwards, opening into wideness, becoming silent as it opens, and hold the pure awareness of that in essence, holding totality of all the parts and properties, and just staying in that. And if you have a particular question, an intention, a need to find an insight or a resolution, you wait in quiet aspiration, in that silent mind, turned upwards. And then gently something enters, plop, it reveals itself. The whole thing becomes clear. You see, you know, and you are what you know. And that's the touch of the intuition. And in this way, the mind can be taught. It can be trained to ascend and to rise to its own highest possibilities, where normally it would be blurred, and taught to remain in silence on those highest levels and open from there until it exceeds itself, opening into something higher than itself. This is the fourth method Sri Aurobindo lists in the training of the intuitive consciousness. And we can do this with all the faculties of the mind, including the rational faculties. So, Vijnana is the original comprehensive consciousness which holds an image of things at once in its essence, its totality, and its parts and properties. And naturally we realize this is happening within us only at a level which is above mind. It is the original, spontaneous, true and complete view of it which belongs properly to the supermind, and of which mind has only a shadow in the highest operation of the comprehensive intellect. So what we have been describing so far is this turning, rising upwards. There is a highest point that the intellect can reach, after which it becomes silent. And that is only a shadow of the supermind's working. Because in the supermind, that essence and unity and parts and properties, all of them are simultaneous, but the essence is real, concrete, as vividly felt as we experience the contact of touch, the sense of our self-awareness. I know I'm conscious, I know I'm alive, I know I'm thinking. As vividly as this is felt, as vividly supermind knows the essence of rose and the essence of flower and the essence of creation. It knows it as vividly. In fact, it knows also totality and parts and properties as vividly, but completely differently, more completely, more truly. So for us, there is an essence of rose, and then there is the totality of rose as one example, or maybe even a variation of many examples. But in supermind, the totality of rose is not a series of pieces, but of a series of forms of rose, but all possible rose forms and variations held simultaneously in a single totality of experience, concrete, vivid, self-existent. And the parts of rose are also held in all variations of parts, but parts not as separate pieces like this is petal and that is stem, but parts as expressions of the totality of rose, and totality of rose as expressions of essence of rose, simultaneously in a single unity of experience. And all properties also merely colorings, superficial reflections of the parts, totalities and essence of rose, which is all real, concrete, one. Therefore, Sri Aurobindo calls it real idea. It is idea, But to mental consciousness, essential idea is abstract idea. To supramental consciousness, essential idea is the reality, of which each rose and its variation is a reflection, is a specific form and a limited, fragmented, broken, reflected expression. That's why the supermind is the original, spontaneous, true, and complete view of things. Original because it originates all of our experiences, including the mind's experiences of senses and divisions. Spontaneous because the thing exists without effort. Mind has to construct, to join, to generalize, to extract from all these experiences an essential idea, as we did with neural networks or as we do through our life experiences. True, because in supermind the thing exists by itself without reference to other things. It is a reality of consciousness which exists whether manifested or not. Whereas in our mind, our idea of rose is a reflection through our eyes into our life energy, into our mind, and constructions at each step. And therefore, as Sri Aurobindo has used the word before, an eidolon, a false image. Our experience of rose is a false image going through 3 layers of distortion and reflection constructed by the mind. Whereas in supermind, rose and idea of rose is spontaneously self-existent. It is not a construction, it is not a reflection, it is real. And here we see pieces, we know by pieces in mind, but in supermind it is complete, whole, nothing is excluded, nothing lost, nothing forgotten, all is held in a single experience. Therefore, original, spontaneous, true, and complete view. Original because originating, spontaneous because self-existent, real, not crafted, true because existing by itself, not going through a construction, complete because including it all, nothing is ever lost, nothing is fragmented. All is held in oneness. So, which belongs properly to the supermind, and of which mind has only a shadow in the highest operations of the comprehensive intellect. Even here, if we took a little trouble, we could explore each of the words Sri Aurobindo uses. In the highest operations of the comprehensive intellect. Why does he say comprehensive intellect? Well, because he's speaking of the comprehensive consciousness. No, not just that. Because in the intellect there are many faculties. And in most human beings, only some of these faculties are developed. In particular, the analytic faculty is developed in most people to some extent, that too, not quite rudimentary, not really developed to its highest possibilities. But the comprehensive faculty, the synthetic faculty and the comprehensive faculties are not developed or very weakly developed, much less than the analytic. So when, for example, we are given, exposed to a complex experience, we glimpse this in different parts. In our consciousness, we retain them in different pieces. We rarely, if ever, are conscious of the totality of the experience. So let's say you meet a person. Let's say you know a person for many, many years, someone closely. And you are asked to express what this person is like. You'll find your mind first flitting across, what shall I say, okay, and then it starts with this piece, appearances, then perhaps behavioral patterns, then perhaps likes and dislikes. And after you've done, this is it, there's nothing more I can say. I could ask a question, what are the person's ideals? Ah, yes, and then you fill in some more. And so with pieces, you have caught a person from various angles. What does the person experience himself or herself to be? Ah, that I don't have words for. If at all I know, most likely I don't even know. I think I know the person very well, but all I know is behavior patterns and habitual patterns. I don't know the person in the identity, in the way the person knows himself or herself. But a comprehensive consciousness would look at all these behavior patterns and then cut through to experience what it is that the person feels, is, knows himself to be. But this is natural only to the intuitive consciousness where you experience an identity. But it is this tendency to go to the essence of things which is the character of the comprehensive faculty in the mind, of which we normally have developed only a part of the synthesis. We have many pieces and we join the pieces together to make a whole. But in making the whole, you have still not got to the essence in the comprehension. This is the term used also in certain kinds of linguistic tests. A comprehension test. Notice what it points to. Your understanding. Not understanding as in repeating what you read, but a deeper understanding of the thing which is not described in the text. So there's a story, for example, such and such a person goes and does this, does that, says this, speaks that. And then in the comprehension test, why did the person react like this? And now you're required to go inside the person and describe the motivations behind those behavior patterns. So you see, the whole idea of comprehension is a going deeper inside to hold in a synthetic completeness. So this particular working of the mind, of going within to hold the totality, is not developed in people. It is not developed at all consciously in our current educational system. And if we had brought this particular power forward and taught it consciously, the world would be a very different place. Because automatically, spontaneously, rather than fragmenting a person into pieces, rather than fragmenting a discussion into 3 or 4 different viewpoints in conflict, our mind would turn to include the totality within which all these viewpoints are aspects. We would see the whole and we would say, here's the resolution. And if all of us saw the whole, whatever personal perspective we have, we would see it not in conflict but in complement with others. We would automatically come to a resolution, effortlessly, because that faculty would be spontaneous and effortless. But right now it's not developed. It can be trained, should be trained, and as we develop that power and take that comprehensive power of the intellect to its highest, that highest station is still a shadow of the supermind. You see, we just took one word and how much insight can be gained from it. Each of Sri Aurobindo's sentences is full of a comprehensive experience, is an expression of a comprehensive experience. The wording and the form in which it is expressed, when seen by a mind which is used to fragmentation and ideas, will pick ideas, put 2 or 3 ideas in sequence, or take a summary, broad idea and reduce the whole text to that. And the result is a huge loss. It is only when we train the mind to see comprehensively that we realize, Sri Aurobindo is holding a single package of experience in the sentence, or the paragraph, or the chapter, or the book. And in that completeness, here, this word represents this angle, that word, that angle, that word, that angle. And we can look at it from each of those, ask why this word, and you get a whole deep and complete perspective. And so we will, in our study, we've been striving to do that throughout. It makes it somewhat longish, but you see how much more emerges from this kind of a study than by summarizing each sentence or each paragraph into simple ideas. I'm reminded of a very interesting incident. One of the students in the ashram, now quite an old man, one of the early students of the ashram school, was attending classes of Sri Aurobindo's writings, and having been through several months of it, he began to get more and more uneasy until he couldn't contain himself. And then he spoke to the mother. He said, "Mother, earlier I had this great idea of Sri Aurobindo, but as I am listening, as I am studying in these classes, I find I am losing respect for Sri Aurobindo. Because the more we study and the more we are taught, the more I realize, oh, these are very simple ideas. I could have thought them. What's new? What is special? Why does Sri Aurobindo have to use so many words to say something so simple? I'm losing respect for him." And the mother was very quiet for a while. And then she spoke to the registrar and asked for this child to be separated from the class and told him, "Hereafter you will study on your own, you will read on your own." And he said after that, when he began to read on his own, his whole perspective began to change again. Now obviously the teacher was reducing things to ideas, basic ideas, simple ideas, summary ideas. And as a result, reducing the content. But this is how an untrained mind or a purely analytically trained intellect will tend to reduce that which is written not as an analytic expression, but as an experiential articulation. An intuitive consciousness articulating a living experience in rational terms. When you read a book of philosophy, it is dry logic, chains of ideas with summary ideas. This kind of an exercise would be very useful, because that's all there is in that content. But to a writing such as Sri Aurobindo's, you cannot do that. It was the reason why the mother discouraged many of the classes and in the form in which they took place. So, let's review this, what we have studied. Vijnana is the original comprehensive consciousness which holds an image of things at once in its essence, its totality, and its parts and properties. It is the original, spontaneous, true, and complete view of it, of the idea, of the image, which belongs properly to the supermind, and of which mind has only a shadow in the highest operations of the comprehensive intellect. And yet, this shadow which the comprehensive intellect at its highest can reach is our gateway to prepare the mind for a higher functioning. Now recall, I mentioned this as the fourth method Sri Aurobindo teaches for developing the intuitive consciousness. The first three, of course, lead towards that also. The fourth makes for a richer development. So it's like this. Intellect, power of mind, is here as a substance with faculties and powers of consciousness. Above that, let's say there's a passage of intuition and further gradations into supermind. When the supramental consciousness enters, infuses its light and force into the active mental consciousness, the mind acquires the character of perception of the supermind, but the substance of the mind, although illumined, may not be plastic enough, may not be richly trained sufficiently that the supermind can use it to express itself completely. The mind may still be dull, resistant, having some inertia. It may still have old habits, not sufficiently plastic, and still the supermind can express through it. But the forms of expression would be narrowed to conventional, limited expressions. We want ideally the mental consciousness to become completely plastic to the touch of the supermind, completely pure and transparent to its expression. That's why the training is so important. In the four methods, first is silencing the mind for developing intuition. First is silencing the mind. Second is rising above the center of the brain thought into a higher center of consciousness in the subtle body. And the third is waiting for the inspiration to initiate action. And the fourth is raising all the faculties and powers of the intellect to their highest potential until they exceed their own limitations and rise into something higher. It is this which we have been describing in this station, which he has called the highest operations of the comprehensive intellect. If you have not done the fourth method, you may still develop intuitive consciousness, but you will not have the rich possibility of a developed mind, which the supermind can use as a powerful instrument for action. There are simple minds which are given to the higher consciousness. The divine still uses them simply. Similarly, we may say of the whole personality, if the individuality is formed, then it can offer itself as an instrument to the divine. If it is not formed, you do not have an instrument. How can the divine use it, the mother says. But on the other hand, the formation of individuality itself can be a simple individual or a rich and complex personality. And if it is in all its richness and complexity purified and transformed and offered to the divine, then the divine can act with something far more complex, far more rich in its action, because that which comes is infinitely rich in infinite potential. And if it has to act through a simplified instrument, well, it has to reduce. If it can act through a rich instrument, it can act much more, express much more completely and diversely, beautifully in its richness. And potentially, if sufficiently enriched, we may even be able to express something of the infinity of the richness of the origin. And that's why it is so important to develop the personality in all its facets, in all its possibilities. And that's why we have such a long journey of life across so many incarnations, so many millions of years perhaps, to develop precisely all the possible facets of experience, except it's too slow because too unconscious. And in this life, if we can take the trouble to enrich our personality in whatever direction of our natural temperament, as far as possible, in this context of a spiritual foundation on which the personality's enrichment is done, then it can be a great help for the divine work. The mother used to appreciate, when she saw this kind of a rich personality, she used to appreciate very much. And then, of course, the purity and the readiness of it. She looked at a person and she saw the full. And sometimes instantly she would burst out in joy. She would say, ah, when she saw a beautiful being, instrument ready. I'm staying on the same theme. An interesting reference is there in Sri Aurobindo's Record of Yoga. It's now many years since I have read it, but the idea was this. There was a period when Sri Aurobindo was experimenting with certain forms of what is now called channeling, automatic writing of some kind. And people would raise names, and the automatic writing would describe the personality and certain situations. There would be questions and they would be replied to and so on. At some point, when the mother's name was raised, someone said, what about Meera? And the writing described in great detail. So it went like this. With each person, the writing described how many facets of personality were there. And often there were 2 or 3, sometimes a dozen, which was considered quite rich. And when the mother's name came, I think, if I remember right, it wrote 300 facets of personality. It's quite remarkable, considering that almost everybody there had only a few, ranging at most into a dozen. Sri Aurobindo has another letter where he makes a suggestive comment in this direction. Somebody saw Sri Aurobindo in a particular form which was thinner and darker, and Sri Aurobindo says it is one of the aspects of his personality. And then he made a comment that he does not have as many aspects. The mother has many more, much greater variety and richness of aspects. And that's why you can see something so extraordinary in the way she was manifesting at each moment, with each person, in each situation, a completely different facet, a completely different aspect would come forward, spontaneously, effortlessly, and smoothly, never in conflict. Okay, so this much for Vijnana. This is the most important concept because the most high, most complete, the original, spontaneous, true and complete view, which belongs properly to the supermind. Next is Prajnana. We don't have enough time for that, but just to complete the discussion, Prajnana is the consciousness which holds an image of things before it as an object with which it has to enter into relation and to possess by apprehension and combined analytic and synthetic cognition. We'll discuss in detail next time, but the idea is this: there's an object separate from you and there's a need to reach out. Sanjnana is the contact of consciousness with an image of things by which there is a sensible possession of it in its substance. Again, we'll discuss in detail later, but essentially it is the idea that you reach out, grasp and draw into yourself. And Ajnana is the operation by which consciousness dwells on an image of things so as to hold, govern and possess it in power. Essentially, it is the idea of possessing with power. Now, all three of which we will take up in a detailed study, as detailed perhaps as we have done for Vijnana. But you understand how important it is to go in detail like this to get a full sense of it. And then you will see in the completeness of these four, spontaneously recognize what parts of these four functionings naturally belong to the supermind, what part the mind has and does not have yet in its evolution, and then naturally what is necessary to complete the evolution into supramental consciousness. And this is the theme of the next paragraph after. We pause here and look back at the whole thing before us in the totality. Try to hold as far as possible in the highest operation of our comprehensive intellect the full picture of what has been conveyed by Sri Aurobindo. And just reread these two sentences of Vijnana. Vijnana is the original comprehensive consciousness which holds an image of things at once in its essence, its totality, and its parts and properties. It is the original, spontaneous, true and complete view of it, which belongs properly to the supermind, and of which mind has only a shadow in the highest operations of the comprehensive intellect. We can meditate on this for a while.